טוב, ברוכים הבאים לסמינר המחקר. עכשיו רוצים להתחיל. ברוכים הבאים לסמינר המחקר. אני נרגש ומתכבד להזמין את נועה שיין, שהייתה פרופסור ועכשיו מצב בחירה.
לא, הייתה מצב בחירה ועדיין לא.
מצב בחירה בחוג לפילוסופיה באוניברסיטה העברית, בראשת מרכז אדלשטיין להיסטוריה ופילוסופיה של המדע והטכנולוגיה והרפואה באוניברסיטה העברית בירושלים. עיקר מחקרה עוסק בהיסטוריה של הפילוסופיה של העת החדשה, עם דגש על יחסי הגומלין בין פיזיקה ומטאפיזיקה אצל הוגים שונים כמו דקארט, שפינוזה וניוטון. רוב מאמריה עוסקים במטאפיזיקה של שפינוזה. אני יודע שאני השתמשתי לא מעט במחקר של נועה על ניוטון בעיקר, וגם על דקארט, אז אני מאוד נרגש לשמוע מה שיש לה להגיד על הנרי מור. Henry Moore's charge of materialist atheism, contrasting accusations against Descartes and Spinoza. בבקשה, נועה.
תודה רבה אורי על ההזמנה.
לשאול.
אכן, והסכם. אז כיף גם לראות גם אנשים שאני מכירה וגם אנשים שאני לא מכירה. אני טיפה אנוכית בפרזנטציה היום, כי היא בעיקר לשימוש שלי. זה עבודה שאני עדיין, היא מאוד בעיצומה עדיין. אז זה בעיקר הזדמנות בשבילי קצת להציג אותה, ובעיקר הזמנה לחשוב יחד. אני כן אתן את ההרצאה באנגלית. מה שאני מקווה שהמבנה המאוד גדול יהיה ברור, יהיו רגעים של הרבה פרטים למי שעמוק בתוך דקארט ושפינוזה ומור. זה יהיה מאוד מאוד מעניין הפרטים, לי זה מאוד מאוד מעניין הפרטים, אבל אם אתם לא כל יום חיים את ההגיונות של דקארט ושפינוזה, אני מקווה שעדיין הסיפור הגדול יהיה מעניין לי סובייקטיבית, אני מקווה שהוא יהיה אינטר סובייקטיבית גם מעניין. אז אני אעבור לאנגלית, כמובן שאת הדיון בעברית או באנגלית. My presentation today is based on a chapter I'm developing for a book that focuses on Spinoza's metaphysics. The book grapples with understanding what constitutes finite things in Spinoza's metaphysics and whether their existence is compatible with other metaphysical commitments of his. In addressing this question, I closely examine the notion of finite or particular bodies. The emphasis on Spinoza's physics in looking for answer to this question may seem surprising, especially considering that contemporary commentators are often quite dismissive about Spinoza's physics. Many have interpreted his work as adopting Descartes' problematic physics while attempting to align it with his unique metaphysical concepts, which render it utterly hopeless. Although Spinoza indeed inherits some key principles from Descartes, he diverges from Cartesian thought at critical junctures. One significant argument I intend to make in the book is that not only is it important to analyze Spinoza's account of body, but also that engaging seriously with this concept of body and extension has an interesting philosophical tradition that ought to be considered more closely. More specifically, Spinoza's metaphysical foundations for physics were perceived as particularly troubling to thinkers such as Henry Moore, Anne Conway, and Isaac Newton, possibly via Clarke, precisely because they offered a substantial alternative to Cartesian physics. Henry Moore, which you may not know about, was one of the Cambridge Platonists, 1614 to 1687. And he engaged directly with Descartes and Newton, tutored Anne Conway, and authored two critiques of Spinoza, plays an important role in this story. While we often consider Newton and Moore primarily as responding to Descartes, I wish to highlight Spinoza as another crucial figure with whom these thinkers grappled influencing the development of their own views. The chapter I will present today aims to clarify Moore's reaction to Spinoza, contrasting it in his response to Descartes. So the big punchline is, לטעמי, ששפינוזה משחק תפקיד חשוב במעבר הזה בין דקארט לניוטון, בעיקר כי הוא מציע בסיס לפיזיקה שמתקנת את הפיזיקה הקרטזיאנית, אבל לא הפיזיקה הניוטונית. Henry Moore's reaction to Spinoza's philosophy was vehement. He published 2 works aimed at criticizing Spinoza directly. The first against the Tractatus Theologico Politicus, and the second against the Ethics with its very long title, A Brief and Firm Confutation of the Demonstration of the 2 propositions in Spinoza, which are the chief columns of atheism, namely that necessary existence pertains to substance as substance, and that there is but a single substance in the universe. In what follows, I'll refer to this work as the Confutation. Moore's despise of Spinoza is made apparent over and over throughout his work. He seems not to miss an opportunity to describe him as a madman, delirious, or sordid and vile atheist. This is in quite stark contrast to his reaction to Descartes. It is clear that although Moore disagreed with Descartes and considered his views to lead to atheism, he held them in high regard. Seeing as for Moore, Cartesianism and Spinozism lead or espouse atheism, this invites us to wonder what accounts for the stark difference in his responses to these philosophers. One might initially assert that Descartes shares several core theological commitments with Henry Moore, such as the conception of God as creator and the possibility of the mortality of the soul. While this observation is certainly true, I propose that there is another significant reason for the difference in his attitude towards him. Moore recognized that Spinoza's metaphysics harbors a serious and considerable threat to his own metaphysics. First, Spinoza amends Descartes' metaphysical physics in a way that answers some of Moore's own objections to Descartes. Second, in doing so, Spinoza comes too close to comfort to Moore's own positive views in certain respects. This, in turn, will put in great relief not only the trivial disparity in the theological commitments, but also how Spinoza's metaphysical foundations for physics could be construed as a viable alternative to Descartes, yet lead to what Moore would consider abhorrent consequences, namely that everything follows from God with what he calls blind necessity. זה פחות או יותר התפריט לערב. Moore argues that Descartes' materialism, despite Descartes' own theological commitments, inherently leads to atheism, citing the lack of sufficient safeguards against this outcome in Cartesian thought. He says, if the Cartesian philosophy, both physical and metaphysical, were allowed to abide, I certainly fear to say in what a proclivity and in how dangerous a precipitancy towards atheism the souls of mortals will be placed, as no sufficiently firm check occurs in its ways of philosophizing, which prohibits them from lapsing into this insane disease. At first glance, this claim might seem quite odd to us, since it seems impossible to make any sense of Descartes' metaphysics and epistemology while denying the central role God plays in both. Ontologically, any finite substance depends on God for its existence. Epistemically, our clear and distinct perception of God guarantees that everything we clearly and distinctly perceive is true. The fact that the charge of atheism strikes us as odd can lead us either to dismiss Moore's engagement with Cartesian ideas, since he appears to grossly misunderstand them, or, and I suggest we opt for the alternative, treat Moore's view with curiosity. What exactly was it in the Cartesian setup Moore perceived to lead to atheism? Moore, in arguing that Cartesianism leads to atheism, attributes to Descartes the claim that for Descartes the material substance necessarily exists. I quote, that matter, according to its innate idea in our mind, cannot not exist, or existence from the bare reasons of its ideas necessarily agrees with matter, end quote. This interpretation appears initially incongruous with Descartes' explicit statement in Principles 152 that material substance is created and thus dependent on God for its existence. But as for corporeal substance and mind, or created thinking substance, these can be understood to fall under this common concept, things that need only the concurrence of God in order to exist. This is in stark contrast to Descartes' characterization of substance in the strict sense. I quote, "By substance, we understand nothing other than a thing which exists in such a way as to depend on no other thing for its existence. And there is only one substance which can be understood to depend on no other thing whatever, namely God. All other substances, including corporeal substance, exist only through God's concurrence." Additionally, one of the primary conclusions reached by the meditator in Meditation 5 is the contingency of the material substance existence. In this meditation, the meditator is asked to consider her idea of material things while setting to one side the question of whether they exist or not. The meditator will come to recognize that the essence of corporeal things does not depend on her, yet she can have a clear and distinct idea of it. For our purposes, one important conclusion that the meditator can come to have a clear and distinct idea of extension, and this idea does not include existence. This is contrasted in the same meditation with the meditator's idea of God, whose essence includes existence, and we cannot perceive it clearly and distinctly without existing. Why then does Moore claim that on Descartes' view, the material substance exists necessarily? While Moore cites Principles Part 2, Article 21 twice in support of his argument, the relevance of this citation is less than transparent. Indeed, Alexander Jacobson, who edits and translated Moore, notes in a footnote to the Manual of Metaphysics that the citation is likely erroneous, suggesting that Moore intended to refer to Principles 2, Part 1. Nonetheless, I argue that a careful interpretation of Principles 221, while keeping in mind Moore's own commitments, supports his conclusion that extension exists necessarily for Descartes. Principles 221 establishes that the extension of the world is indefinite, and Descartes explains. What is more, we recognize that this world, that is, the whole universe of corporeal substance, has no limit to its extension. For no matter where we imagine the boundaries to be, there are always some indefinitely extended spaces beyond them, which we not only imagine, but also perceive to be imaginable in a true fashion that is real. And it follows that these spaces contain corporeal substance, which is indefinitely extended. For, as has already been shown very fully, the idea of the extension which we conceive to be in a given space is exactly the same as the idea of corporeal substance. Descartes seeks to establish at least two things in this article. The first is the claim that extension has no limits. The second is that although it has no limits, it is not infinite, a term he reserves only for God. Moore, however, focuses on a slightly different point that is brought out in this article. His rephrasing proves illuminating. That sophism of Descartes, by which he is seen to infer the necessity of its extension existence from the fact that we cannot not conceive a certain extension extending everywhere to infinity, nor any extension at all unless corporeal. What catches Moore's attention is that if we try to imagine boundaries to extension, that is, conceive of somewhere where extension is not, we fail, since we always imagine in a true fashion extension beyond it. That is, there is no place where we can imagine extension not existing. Moore seems to suggest that the inability to imagine extension as non-existence implies that, touch Descartes, we in fact conceive of it as necessarily existing. As he says, we cannot not conceive of extension everywhere. For Moore, the move from acknowledging that we can always imagine extension beyond any boundaries we impose to the more radical claim that extension exists necessarily would have come naturally. We can speculate that when he reads Principles 221, he does so with a bias, specifically through the lens of his own beliefs. In Moore's framework, what he calls immobile extension exists from itself and is infinite. Thus, I suggest that when Moore encounters Article 21, he interprets it as clumsily approaching what he perceives as the true view, namely his own. In this light, he sees Descartes as touching upon the right view, albeit in a confused manner. Consequently, what Descartes vaguely characterizes as the indefiniteness of extension is interpreted by Moore as an awkward way of alluding to the authentic infinity of immobile extension. Furthermore, Moore may understand Descartes' observation about our inability to conceptualize boundaries to extension, as he puts it, that we cannot not conceive of extension everywhere, as rooted in the fact that his immobile extension exists necessarily. What Moore finds objectionable is the conflation of these correct intuitions with Descartes' further claim regarding the identity of matter and space, or extension. It is this combination of the identity of matter and space, alongside Moore's interpretation of the aforementioned claims, that lead to the conclusion he finds troubling, namely that corporeal substance necessarily exists. To put it perhaps in somewhat cruder terms, we can reconstruct what Moore believes Descartes is committed to thus. Infinite or indefinite extension cannot be conceived except as existing. What cannot be conceived except as existing exists necessarily. Corporeal substance is identical to extension. Therefore, corporeal substance exists necessarily. This reconstruction of Moore's argument clarifies his assertion that Cartesianism leads to materialism. It demonstrates that according to Moore's interpretation, the Cartesian is committed to the view that corporeal substance exists necessarily, thereby excluding God from the equation, so to speak. This view undermines the metaphysical necessity for God to create the material world. If the material world exists necessarily and is not created by God, then the necessity of divine explanation of natural phenomena diminishes significantly. The gap between this notion and atheism is indeed quite narrow. Therefore, rather than viewing the reference to Principles 221 as a mere error, a reconstruction elucidates why Moore would consider it central to the argument that corporeal substance exists necessarily. More generally, it highlights why this claim is crucial in the progression towards materialism and subsequently atheism. A variation of this concern regarding the necessary existence of the material world later reappears in Moore's confutation of Spinoza's metaphysics. We have Cartesianism leading to materialism from the fact that material substance seems to exist necessarily for Descartes. A more speculative reason that Moore might have believed Descartes is committed to the necessary existence of material substance arises from the distinctness of the innate idea of extension from the idea of God. This speculation, in turn, helps clarify the transition from materialism to atheism. One way to interpret the wax example in meditation 2 is that the meditator, albeit unaware, achieves a clear and distinct perception of extension or the essence of material things while examining the piece of wax. Initially, she observes that the wax can lose all its sensible properties, leading her to conclude that none of these properties constitute her understanding of the wax. Descartes then asked, so what was it in the wax that I understood with such distinctness? Evidently, none of the features which I arrived by means of the senses, end quote. By peeling off the sensible properties, the meditator recognizes that something of the wax remains. Quote, let us concentrate, take away everything which does not belong to the wax, and see what is left, merely something extended, flexible, and changeable, end quote. While the meditator does not yet fully appreciate that she is perceiving the essence of material things, she will recognize this in retrospect. Crucially, she clearly and distinctly perceives intellectually the essence of material things before recognizing God's existence, which comes only in meditation 3. Although perceiving the essence of material things does not immediately imply its necessary existence, meditation 2 establishes several points that Moore would find objectionable. First, it highlights the distinctness of the idea of the essence of material things, as we said. Second, it exemplifies that we automatically assent to what we perceive clearly and distinctly. And specifically, we perceive clearly and distinctly the idea of the essence of material things. Finally, the meditator seems to perceive the essence of material things clearly and distinctly before or independently from her idea of God. Thus, even in meditation 2, the groundwork is laid for Moore's objection that, quote, from hence it is that Descartes is thought to decline the most well-known and most secure way of demonstrating the existence of God from the visible phenomena of the world, end quote. Moore's objection is directed at Descartes' mechanistic view of the world in general, rather than specifically at meditation 2. But noteworthy that the distinctness of the wax idea occurs before meditation 3. While one can read meditation 5, as I said earlier, as showing the difference between God's necessary existence and extension's contingent existence, Moore might be reading meditation 6 along with the opening of the principles of part 2 as implying the opposite. What Moore might be latching on to, that he finds objectionable, is the idea that there is nothing preventing us from supposing the existence of material things, or rather, that our sensory ideas incline us with no mechanism to refrain us from doing so, supposing the existence of material things. Recalling Moore's rephrasing of Principles 221, claiming that we cannot not think of extension being everywhere, we can see how he might also interpret the fact that nothing prevents us from thinking that material things exist to the stronger conclusion that we think that they necessarily exist. Descartes, of course, isn't committed to this, but Moore might think his view nonetheless implies this, or can be seen to leading to this. This would be another route of why Moore would claim that for Descartes, the material world exists necessarily, and hence leading to materialism. The distinctness of the idea of extension from that of God is related to Moore's claim against mechanism as well. As Moore sees it, Hobbes and Descartes are in the same boat in this respect. The excising of final causes from the explanation of the material world, as well as admitting only mechanical explanation, leaves God out of the picture, so to speak. Although Moore might have initially been drawn to this kind of explanation, it seems that as time went on, he grew more weary of it, since it seemed to pull towards atheism. Mechanism can be seen as leading to atheism, since God will no longer be necessary for explaining phenomena. What harms religion is a possible resolution of all phenomena into purely mechanical causes, not even the bodies of plants or animals accepted. Indeed, as if this corporeal world, on condition only that so much motion be supposed to be imposed on matter, as is in fact found in it till now, can generate itself, which, however, is the Cartesian hypothesis. As we've seen, Moore thinks that Descartes, or Cartesianism, implies that the material world exists necessarily, thus leading to materialism and thereby diminishing and eviscerating God's metaphysical role and thus leading to atheism. More, however, raise another objection to Descartes that will be relevant when looking back at Spinoza. On the one hand, according to Descartes, God causes and sustains the quantity of motion in the material world. Yet on the other, Moore claims, God cannot act on the material world. God cannot act on the material world because, strictly speaking, God, for Descartes, is not extended. This objection relies on Moore's own adherence to the principle that all action must be local. This is from a letter from Moore to Descartes. And that God is indeed extended in his way, I judge it to be plain on this ground that he is omnipresent and lodges within the whole machine and each small part of the world. For how was he to implant motion in matter, which you yourself, Descartes, acknowledge he did at one time and still does now, unless he touched, as it were, the matter of the world in the closest degrees, or at least did so at some time in the past, which he assuredly could never have done had he not been everywhere present and occupying every single region. God is therefore extended and spread abroad in his way, and therefore he is an extended substance, says Moore. To see exactly what troubles Moore, we need to disentangle a few ideas that are run through quickly in this letter. In the background, of course, is Descartes' identification of matter and space. According to Descartes, if matter implies divisibility, it cannot be applicable to God. The identity that Descartes draws between matter, space, and internal place to say that something is present or located in space is to say that it is material and vice versa. That is to say that something is in Moore highlights this idiosyncratic implication of Descartes' view, calling attention to the fact that God and minds are not material, and thus cannot be spatially located. By way of ridicule, he calls this view nullivism, from the Latin nowhere. He says in the preface to the Manual of Metaphysics, spirits or incorporeal substances, although they exist, can, however, be nowhere. And if they are somewhere, they are not spirits, but it is necessary that they be corporeal substances. Oh, the harsh, or rather ridiculous and impossible condition of incorporeal substances, which are admitted into the universe by Descartes only on the condition that they exist nowhere in the universe. Moore takes it as axiomatic that to be is to be somewhere. Therefore, if on Descartes' view only material things can be spatially located, this implies that immaterial substances, mind and God, cannot be spatially located and would therefore exist nowhere. Moore draws out the implication of existing nowhere. To exist nowhere means not to exist at all. That is, Moore sees Descartes as committed to a contradiction. Mind and God exist and exist nowhere. That is, they do not exist. This is another route via which we can understand why Moore might think that Cartesianism leads to materialism. Only material things can be somewhere, and therefore only material things exist. Subsequently, in the same preface, Moore makes the same point explicitly with respect to God, pointing out what he takes to be a grave inconsistency in Descartes' metaphysics. Paraphrasing what he thinks Descartes is committed to, he says, there is certainly a God, but God is nowhere, either in the world or outside the world. Matter is not moved by itself, but by God. God, however, is not, nor ever has, nor ever was present either to any part of matter or to the whole of it by which he bestowed motion on matter. Moore here is repeating the implication that God, since he is not material, cannot be spatially located. He moves on to rephrasing Descartes' claim that God is the primary cause and preserver of a determinate quantity of motion in the material world. He immediately, however, points out that God would have to do this without being present or located anywhere, which he takes to be absurd. That is, if an action occurred, it occurred somewhere. Given that Descartes holds that God acts on a material substance, Moore takes him to be tacitly committed to holding that God has to be present where the action takes place. However, on Descartes' view, strictly speaking, God can be nowhere, and therefore can act nowhere, and therefore cannot be the primary cause of motion in the corporeal substance. So here are a few consequences of Cartesianism. Since for Descartes, space equates matter and space, only material things can be located. Since God is incorporeal, he cannot be anywhere and therefore cannot act on anything. Specifically, he can't even create the material world. That's the little, in the letters between them. Oh. So what we've done up until now is see how Moore reads Descartes to be committed to materialism and how that materialism leads to atheism. Spinoza's metaphysics seems to instantiate Moore's fear that Cartesianism leads to materialism and ultimately to atheism. That is, Moore can be understood to read Spinoza's metaphysics as taking Cartesianism to its ultimate and catastrophic consequences. Moore seems to trace this line of reasoning thus. Like Descartes, extension is material for Spinoza. Furthermore, the material world exists necessarily, seeing as any substance exists necessarily for Spinoza. And finally, no substance is created, and relatedly, there isn't a multiplicity of substances. In Moore's eyes, then, the fact that for Spinoza the material world exists necessarily, and that any phenomenon can be explained in material terms, amounts to a species of materialism. The denial of the multiplicity of created substances and a creative God in turn amounts to atheism. At the same time, and much less comfortable for Moore, Spinoza's metaphysics can be seen as amending Descartes in a way that answers some of Moore's more serious critiques. These amendments will prove to be threatening to Moore because they do so in a way that on the one hand brings Spinoza closer to Moore's view by holding infinite extension to be associated with God, but on the other deny core theological tenets such as creation, freedom of the will, and the eternity of the soul. In particular, Spinoza would be amending Descartes in such a way as to account for all activity being local, as well as God being extended. But perhaps the deepest threat Spinoza's metaphysics seems to pose to Moore, as Moore reads Spinoza, is that it purports to show that all natural phenomena can be deduced from infinite extension. While Moore's efforts are directed at placing a great distance between his own views and those of Spinoza, given that he is a careful reader of both Descartes and Spinoza, it is reasonable to assume that he noticed and was worried about the way in which Spinoza's view came close to his own, or at least answers some of Moore's objections to Descartes. So what I'm going to do now is show how Spinoza's Foundation for Physics answers Moore's critiques of Descartes, how it comes. כן, כן.
יכולה לציין את התאריכים של שני החיבורים שמתייחסת אליהם? או בערך?
לא כרגע. אבל 1670, אני חושבת.
המכתבים לדקארט זה
זה לפני, כן.
1660 או משהו. כן.
המכתבים לדקארט, כן, החיבורים נגד שפינוזה בערך 70.
לא, סליחה, 1650 דקארט נפטר, זה שנות ה-40, המכתב לדקארט. מה?
כמה בדיוק בשנות ה-40?
1648 או משהו.
כן. אוקיי. Spinoza can be read as answering Moore's objection that for Descartes only bodies are spatially located, while God and minds are not. We can read Spinoza as asserting that everything is located spatially. This would follow from Proposition 2, Part 2, where it says extension is an attribute of God, or God is an extended thing, coupled with Proposition 15 of Part 1, everything that is in God. Nonetheless, it is true that anything and any action in Spinoza's metaphysics can be spatially located, or at least have an extended analog or counterpart. For Spinoza, it would be true to say that the mind is where the body is, trivially, because they're identical, right? This is reinforced by Proposition 7 of Part 2. Insofar as the mind and the body are one and the same thing, the mind is located where the body is situated. Spinoza then isn't a nulibus precisely because anything that has being can be in principle conceived via extension and therefore be spatially located. Another key similarity between Moore and Spinoza is that for both, God, strictly speaking, is extended. In the computation, Moore admits. However, in this philosophical rage, there seems to me to have sprung up by itself from the heat of his tumultuous, agitated mind, just as it sometimes occurred to the delirious to divine in a certain manner in prophecy, the form of infinite and indivisible extension. There is indeed a certain substance of the sort, infinite, indivisible, and extended, with unitary extension, which is absolutely indivisible and infinite, which through what rage I do not know has sprung up in Spinoza's mind here. That this is indeed not matter is in fact certain, of which more later. We can see here Moore, on the one hand, admitting an important similarity between their views, but also immediately his desperate desire to distance himself from Spinoza. Seeing as he does not want to give Spinoza too much credit, he credits Spinoza for arriving at the right idea by delirium rather than by reason. More important, however, is his note at the very end of the passage, which insists that real extension is immaterial. Let us note the similarities first, since it is the similarities between them that I believe is one of the reasons Moore reacts so strongly to Spinoza. In section 8 of chapter 8 of the Manual of Metaphysics, Moore lists an enumeration of more or less 20 titles which metaphysicians attribute to God congruous with immobile extension or internal place. For this infinite and immobile extension will be seen to be not something merely real, which we have noted in the last place, but something divine after we shall have enumerated those divine names or titles which suited exactly and with the greatest certainty make it not possible to be nothing, seeing that so many and such excellent attributes fit it. Of which kinds are those which follow, which metaphysicians specifically attribute to first being? Such as one simple, immobile, eternal, complete, independent, existing from itself, subsisting by itself, incorruptible, necessary, immense, uncreated, uncircumscribed, incomprehensible, omnipresent, incorporeal, permeating and encompassing everything, being by essence, being by act, pure act. For Spinoza, since extension is an attribute of the infinite substance or God, it shares nearly all of the attributes that Moore lists above. Infinite extension for Spinoza is one, since there are no other substances. It is simple in the sense that it is not composed of parts. It is immobile, since there is nothing external to it. It is eternal. It is complete, since it saturates existence. It is independent, existence subsists for itself. It is incorruptible because it is not composed of separable parts. It is necessary. It is immense because there is nothing greater than it. It is uncreated because it is substance. It is uncircumscribed because there is nothing beyond it, or rather, it is not determined by anything else. It is omnipresent, permeating and encompassing everything because anything that is can be conceived as extended. The only characteristic then that Moore lists that he would recognize as one that Spinoza wouldn't share is that extension is incorporeal. Spinoza in the Scholium to Proposition 15 of Part 1 argues preemptively against those who hold that God cannot be corporeal because they believe corporeal substance by its nature is divisible and therefore cannot be infinite. This view assumes that an infinite quantity cannot be composed of parts. Spinoza critiques this reasoning, suggesting that the error lies not in the impossibility of infinite quantity, but in the flawed assumption that such a quantity can be measurable and composed of finite parts. He provides a psychological analysis of the root of the error, explaining that we conceive quantity in two ways. Through the imagination, where it appears finite and divisible, and through the intellect, where it is understood as infinite and indivisible. This error arises because we often perceive quantity through the imagination, which involves confusion, rather than through the intellect, which allows us to recognize extension as a substance that is infinite, unique, and indivisible. Moore is an astute and careful enough reader of Spinoza to recognize the Scholium to 1p15 as a major hurdle for his own view. And in fact, we indeed witness him reacting quite strongly to the Scholium. Moore claims that the Scholium exposes the madness and ignorance of the man wonderfully. After quoting this section of the Scholium, Moore launches a full-scale attack, and I quote, "Can there be said to be anything more unlearned and ignorant than there be an argument of a more disturbed and confused mind and utterly ignorant of the way of considering things than that which the most acute philosopher, as he is called among the most unlearned, boldly and foolishly prattles here? As many lines as there are, so many contradictory or foolish ones there are." End quote. He then proceeds with a multi-point counter-argument against Spinoza's claim regarding quantity. He notes ironically that since the word is sensible, the imagination philosophizes of the universal matter of the world more rightly than the intellect of the most acute Spinoza. Moore seeks to highlight that on his view, there is a fundamental contradiction in saying that something is both corporeal and indivisible. He goes on to ridicule Spinoza, saying, "As if indeed that which is everywhere apprehended as divisible by the senses can rightly and truly be conceived of by the intellect as indivisible. All the particular things of the world, that is, the modes of the material world, are divisible, and yet all the matter of the world everywhere, insofar as it is substance, be indivisible." End quote. Moore then construes divisibility, which he takes to be part of the nature of corporeal things, to entail separability, and therefore to hold the more general assumption that whatever is divisible cannot, by its very nature, be indivisible. Moore accuses Spinoza time and again of being a materialist. Although there is a tradition of treating Spinoza as a materialist, it is not the most natural reading of Spinoza, given the multiplicity of attributes, only one of which is extension, and his insistence on the real distinction among the attributes and the parallel causal relations among modes of different attributes. It is helpful to understand why Moore insists on reading Spinoza as a materialist, if we recall that Moore thinks Descartes is already committed to the view that the material substance exists necessarily. That is, he can be understood to be reading Spinoza as a devolvement of Cartesianism into atheism via materialism. The first is holding that the substance exists necessarily. Moore will identify what he calls two columns that support the claim of material atheism. The first is holding that the substance exists necessarily, and the second, the rejection of created substances. Descartes states, as we saw quite generally, that a substance is what depends on no other thing for its existence. Moore reads Spinoza as taking this strictly and claiming this completely generally, as he does in definition 3 of part 1, and the later proposition 1p6 and 1p7. אני יודעת שאתם לא יודעים, 1p7, 1p6 זה השפת קוד של שפינוזיסטים. You'll take my word. While Descartes, of course, admits there are also created substances, it seems as though Moore wants to distance himself from the view that substance, qua substance, depends on nothing for its existence, that is, exists necessarily. In his response to Spinoza, he says that, of course, the infinite substance or God exists necessarily, but resists quite forcefully that this is a basic characteristic of substance in general. We find Moore saying toward the beginning of the confutation, in objection to 1p7, if it is a universal affirmation, that is, that it pertains to the nature of all substances to exist, I say that it is plainly false. For I contend that it pertains neither to the nature of matter, which is indeed of such a quality that it perishes, neither to the nature of spirits, angel, or human souls, which I clearly consider as substance. Moore then goes on the attack the propositions that lead to this, and turns to discuss 1p6, which states, one substance cannot be produced by another substance. His objection here, rather than relying on the nature of substance in general, focuses on the nature of the infinite substance. He first claims that Spinoza will have to agree with him that, quote, a perfect substance exists so absolutely and infinitely that no perfection is wanting to it, end quote. He then goes on to elaborate that one of these perfections is omnipotence, explaining, quote, if the absolutely perfect being or infinitely perfect substance of whose perfection one is omnipotence, indeed the power of creating, by virtue of the perfection of its nature is, as it were, the cause of itself, that is, of a being infinitely perfect, is it surprising that it can be cause of beings inferior to it by infinite degrees, namely worldly matter, the spirit of nature, the spirit of men and angels, end quote. For Moore, omnipotence is to be understood as the power of creating other substances. Although here we are witness to the fundamental and not surprising disagreement between Moore and Spinoza, whose ground at the end of the day are theological, what is interesting to note is what Moore takes to be Spinoza's main aim. Quote, from this, it does not in the least follow that material substance indeed cannot be produced by another substance, which he so much wishes. That is, Moore wants to call attention to the fact that it is not a contradiction that the material substance be created, because the nature of the infinite substance is such as to create. We can see that Moore's focus is that Moore's focus is on halting the claim that the material world exists necessarily in his discussion of 1p5, as he works his way backward from 1p7. One of his objections to 1p5 is that it is simply contradicts common sense and experience, I quote. Since 600 myriad examples occur in stones, metal, plant, animals, of which it can be demonstrated that many substances of the same nature or having something in common exist in nature. That is, he has in mind here that there is a multiplicity of material substances. He links this discussion with Spinoza's claim in letter 29 that the extended substance is not composed of parts. Although perhaps not overt, Moore connects God's creative power with the real divisibility of matter. Appreciating this explains why Moore goes from evoking God's creative power to holding that it is obvious that there is a multiplicity of substances that share attributes. In the same way that God's omnipotence is to be understood axiomatically for Moore as the power to create, the material world is such that it is divisible into separable parts for him. Thus, we find him saying in response to Spinoza's claim in letter 29, quote, holding that it is foolish and mad to think of the extended substance as consisting of parts of bodies really distinct from one another, is certainly the voice of a maniac, or rather of one delirious, not of one carefully and soundly philosophizing, who, since he posits one substance in the nature of things, and that material, because of that in every way dry and abstract consideration of his, in the hot acropolis of his brain, so to speak, of pure extended substance, deprived, however, of daily external sense and experience, denies it to be composed of parts, even if it is actually divided within itself and is confirmed by the motion of things flowing past one another. End quote. Having attacked the characterization of substance in general as self-existent, Moore turns to attack what he considers to be the other column of atheism, namely the denial of multiplicity of substances. This second column is where Spinoza clearly departs from Descartes and devolves in Moore's eyes from a species of Cartesian materialism to outright atheism. The argument seems to go something like this. Substance exists necessarily, that's what is posited in Proposition 7 of Part 1. Matter exists, Moore takes this to be self-evident. Therefore, matter or corporeal substance exists necessarily. This is the materialism. There's only one substance. Therefore, the only substance that exists, this is more how Moore reconstructs Spinoza, is corporeal substance. Moore takes 1P14, which states, except God, no substance can be or be conceived, as the establishment of de facto materialism, namely that aside from the material substance, no substance exists. I quote. Proposition 14 of Part 1 of the Ethics expressly asserts that there is but one substance in nature, which that very 14th proposition he calls in its humorous manner God. But of course, one in whose writing matter, nature, and God sound the same, end quote. He further bolsters his reading of Spinoza as a materialist by claiming that, quote, if you substitute the name matter or understand that matter is being spoken of, all flow with wonderful ease, since otherwise quite hard paradoxes will be seen, and on account of a reason as frightful as strange, for you may be certain he understands by that God matter, and not an eternal and omniscient, etc. spirit. It is worth noting which proposition Moore chooses to present in the materialistic understanding, since this will make explicit what it takes to be Spinoza's position, and why he thinks it is dangerous. Let us revisit first the proposition that he says flow with wonderful ease when understood in materialistic terms, or rather when substituting God with matter. He begins his translation with 1P16. From the necessity of the divine nature, that is matter, an infinite number of things of infinite modes must follow. He singles out 1P16 because he thinks that what Spinoza is partly establishing in that proposition is that all particular natural phenomena can be derived from the very nature of matter. He then turns to the propositions that establish the determinism that is central to Spinoza's doctrine, and as Moore sees it, to the material mechanistic explanation of the world. Thus, we find him rephrasing 1P17 and its corollaries and scholium, and I quote, only God, that is matter, is a free cause, since he acts solely from the necessity of his nature. And the scholium to that proposition, he says, to God, that is matter, pertains neither nature nor intellect nor will. For the supreme power of God, that is matter, everything has necessarily flowed or continually flows by the same necessity in the same way as it follows from the nature of a triangle from eternity to eternity that its three angles are equal to two right angles. In other words, Moore finds it easier to understand matter as devoid of free will than claiming what seems to be an outright contradiction for him, namely that God has no free will. We find Moore rephrasing next the corollary to 1P25, which is the first place in the Ethics where Spinoza discusses individual things. He says, individual things are nothing but the modifications of the modes of the attribute of God, that is matter, etc. He then, not surprisingly, singles out the next few propositions that lead to Spinoza's deterministic worldview. Moore seems to only be able to make sense of these propositions in their materialistic reformulation. As he said, God does not act from freedom of the will, but will and intellect are related to the nature of God, that is matter, as motion and rest and absolutely all natural things which must be determined by God, that is matter, to exist and to existence and action in a certain manner. Although Moore acknowledges that Spinoza attributes thought to God, given that he denies God free will and the power to act, he doesn't take it too seriously, or rather thinks that Spinoza can't mean too much by it given his other commitments. Thus we find Moore stating here, indeed, since that braggart philosopher so magnificently proclaims against those who contend that God acts with purpose and declares imperiously that all final causes are nothing but human imagination, for which reason, though he asserts thought to be an attribute of God, that is matter, he supposes nevertheless that all things are made or generated by mechanical causes. One of Moore's central objections against materialism, as he construes it that is lacking true power, is that it cannot fully account for natural phenomena. Thus we find him presenting both the descent of a stone and the structure of the human body as natural phenomena that cannot be accounted for mechanically, or as he says, by blind necessity. Oh, the intolerable petulance and haughty virulence of the completely blind and stupid philosophaster, who, since he represents the descent of a stone to the earth as a mechanical cause, must insolently and boastfully hold forth as if he has certainly realized that the structure of the human body was made not by counsel or providence, but by blind mechanical necessity.
נו,
כן,
בסוף?
כן. כן, פחות מ-אמות. We, on the other hand, hold for certain that mechanical power cannot extend so far, and from the certain knowledge of the defect of mechanical powers rather than from the ignorance of them, not only admire the divine wisdom in the operation of nature, but are also amazed by it. Moore argues that the evident order in nature cannot be explained by blind, senseless geometric matter unconsciously, but necessarily producing the most beautiful order of things. Moore analyzes following from the divine nature as following by God's omniscience and omnipotence, that is, but what he calls counsel. This explains why in his discussion of 1p16 he spends time discussing what in his eyes the deficient nature of Spinoza's definition of God. Moore takes it as axiomatic that to say that God's perfection includes omniscience and omnipotence, and that these imply creation by counsel. While recognizing Spinoza's metaphysical system as a potential solution to some of his objections against Descartes, particularly regarding the nature of extension, the foundations of physics, Moore adamantly rejects Spinoza's deterministic worldview and the identification of God with nature. This rejection highlights not merely a disagreement on specific tenets, but a profound anxiety about Spinoza's approach coming too close to his own metaphysical commitments, thereby threatening the very theological foundations of his philosophy. The next chapter of this story aims to bring to light similar considerations that are at work in the background of Newton's formulation of his own metaphysical commitments. The intensity of Moore's reaction, therefore, underscores the significant intellectual and theological states of the debates surrounding Spinoza's work, and demonstrate the role Spinoza played in the move from Cartesian mechanism to Newtonian dynamics.
לא?
אפשר בעברית או באנגלית או...
מה ש...
אוקיי, אז אני אפשר בעברית. אני קצת תוהה איך שפינוזה יכול היה לענות לטענה של מור, שאומר שאנחנו רואים שבטבע ישנו ריבוי של עצמים, כי הם מופרדים זה מזה, והם יכולים להחליק אחד נגד השני. ובבירור ישנו יותר מאחד. השאלה שלי היא איך שפינוזה יכול, איזה סוג של אחדות שפינוזה יכול לייחס לעולם ככה שהוא יוכל להגיד שגם גופים שהם מופרדים זה מזה, הם בעצם לא מופרדים ברמת ההפשטה המתאימה.
אני חושבת שיש שאלה עמוקה, Good.
מבחינתי שתעני באנגלית, כי לא כולם גם יודעים עברית.
Okay, so maybe I'll rephrase the question.
לא.
Okay. I think it's a deep question for Spinoza in general. Once he says there's just one infinite substance, how to account for finite things. And it's a good question to bring out because the way this story about more fits into a general project about how Spinoza can account for finite things. More things that Spinoza is committed that we can do a kind of derivation from extension all the way to finite bodies. Right? That we just think enough of extension, everything is going to follow with blind necessity. But I think it's a question whether Spinoza can give that kind of derivation. I think what's troubling you has led there's a good solid tradition of reading Spinoza as not being committed to the reality of finite things. It's an idealistic reading, sort of, right? Hegel says that in Spinoza, modes are cast into the abyss because they have no reality of their own. I didn't talk about this at all today. My view on that is that there's something artificial about asking a kind of top-down derivation for Spinoza without taking into account that there has to be sort of a bottom-up first. So on my way of reading Spinoza, the two axioms in part 2 that we sense our body affected, especially I put a lot of weight on that axiom. Because in axiom 4, he says, we sense our body affected in many ways. He doesn't say we sense our body affected, he says affected in many ways. So I think Spinoza is starting off, any inquiry starts off with what is self-evident, that we sense there are finite things. The philosophical work is to figure out what kinds of things there are. Right. So for there to be something has to cause it. And then if we did a good enough work in part 1, if we were good students in part 1, in proposition 28 says anything that is finite or has a determinate existence was caused by something else that was finite and has a determinate existence, and so on ad infinitum. So we know what the conditions of possibility of finite stuff are from part 1. And then in part 2, from the fact that it's self-evident that we sense our body affected in many ways, we know that he doesn't have to, another way of saying it, he doesn't have to prove that there are finite things. Clearly they are. But we have to learn to understand what kinds of things those are. They are not finite substances. Why? Because it turns out that a finite substance, that's an incoherent notion. It's either a substance or it's finite, but it can't be both. So that was a very long answer to your question.
I guess we're sticking to English, right? First of all, thanks a lot. I mean, I work on some of the questions historically, so I can raise many quibbles which will be completely unuseful to you, and you'll just wave at them. And when I want to raise something, hopefully try to raise something which will be potentially productive, which is to think in two ways about increasing the role you attribute to Descartes' principia. For two reasons. Those are two questions related to this heading. One is, why would more need to address Descartes at that point? If it's about addressing the arguments or similar arguments, you can choose from any other candidates. Wallace will go and debate Hobbes. Other people can go, Newton would go and debate the 4th century. Other people would go and debate Pomponazzi in the 16th century. Why would you specifically need to address Descartes on this, rather than other people, which might lead to the connection to Spinoza from the other direction? The second thing is, just listening to you, I would guess that the argument could work very well without the meditations at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that
Yes.
it would only lead to a greater focus on the Principia as the thing that more is probably reading, which is why the dating is actually an interesting question. But that we tighten it around it, and I think we lead to a richer understanding of the particularity of the reaction rather than drawing on materials from the limitations which work for you, but I don't think they're necessary as a listener.
That might very well be, but I'm okay with that. Yes, I think all the critiques can be leveled against the principles. It's very clear that Moore knows both very well. And the point of bringing out the meditations is just that it's very clear in the meditations, the distinctness and the fact that the wax example comes before proving God's existence. I think there's something very forceful in that, because the big Moore's big fear is that on Descartes' view, even if Descartes isn't willing to admit it, we can understand the material world without God. And I think so. It can be done only with the principles. It's true. It's
I think the actual quotes spoke in that direction, because you talk more about the quantity of motion in the universe.
Yes.
Which comes straight from the Principia, not from the limitations.
yes, I think that's I think I'm happy. I'm happy with both. It could have been also.
יוסי?
Just one small question. Didn't more wrote replies on the meditations?
But it was more on the Principia.
But he has immediate replies on the meditation.
יוסי?
Without divine guarantee for the necessity of mathematics, nothing holds it. You can't do without God in Descartes.
I think more in a way appreciates that, but he thinks that Cartesianism sort of opens the door to materialism and atheism, and it has, and I think, and that's sort of his claim. But I think where he locates is not so much the guarantee of the truth of the necessary and eternal truth, but the fact that God isn't extended on Descartes' view, the fact that only material things can be extended, more draws out the implication that that means that God cannot act on the material world in any way. And that's brought out in the right, in the exchange of letters between them. That's the point that that Moore really presses Descartes. Now, one of the commentators, Jasper Reed, thinks that in that exchange, Moore sort of forces Descartes to claim, well, God in his way is sort of extended. I think if Descartes would give up on, if would concede that, he's conceding the whole picture. So I think he would have resisted it more. I think in that exchange of letters, what's happening, at the end of the day, Descartes is going to say to Moore, what you're actually asking me is to explain how creation works. Well, obviously I can't explain how creation works. I think that's how he reformed, that's how I reformulate the exchange between them.
יוסי?
I'm afraid I will go in the same direction as Oded, even more to the extreme. So probably it will be of no interest for your argument. I think that it sounds very plausible analysis of the arguments, of the philosophical arguments, but I would ask a set of different questions, like what's the notion of, how's the notion of atheism function in this kind of discourse? Five more, and in the first half of the 17th century. And what's the other context in which Noa developed this kind? And the thing is, especially, I asked about the dates because of Spinoza. Because Spinoza, the relevant writings comes rather late, 60s, 70s.
Yeah.
And while Moore is publishing his writings on atheism, especially during the early 50s, the antidote against atheism, and also the Conjectura Cabalistica, and his deep involvement with the Knopf and Rosenbrock and Van Helmont and the Kabbalah Demudata. Aviram probably would like to say something perhaps about the Genesis interpretation and the problem of creation as they discuss it. So all this set of questions is coming in the sense of the Kabbalistic notion, like also by Conway and Madame Cadmon, and with quite a new, almost inventional usage of the basic concept of atheism, the ways you describe here, because it's not commonsensical. I think that here it's really the beginning of the 17th century that we start to develop all these methods of analyzing dangerous of atheism. Mersenne is a great figure in that sense. And of course, it's very relevant for Spinoza because what is it's going to be crucial for the power history of the philosophy. From 1699, the Amsterdam debate, Wachter, and all this Spinozism, atheism debate will be fatal for the late 18th, early 19th centuries, whole development of the German idealism. So I think that this would be kind of the missing framework, or the conceptual framework for every analysis of these philosophical limitations.
I think it's true. It's definitely true that it's a, and I should have said this, I think, a lot more clearer in the opening. This is far from what I think is the whole story, but I think it's a sliver of the story that, in a way, it's easy to miss because when looking at the larger picture, and I think, and then looking at the theological considerations, then it can quickly seem as if they're completely talking past each other, and I think it's worth holding off a little bit on that and seeing the details of a much narrower discussion between them. Because I think there's, as I said, I think there is something in the details that is interesting. It does shed a slightly different kind of angle. And of course, I say almost nothing about Moore's positive view here. It's really an emphasis of trying to understand his negative view. And then I have sort of like this meta concern in the background, which I think, which is particularly interesting to me, right, is Moore's insistence against Descartes that any phenomena has to be conceived through God, but then not wanting to pay sort of the Spinozistic price of saying, well, if it has to be conceived through God, then it can be deduced with necessity from God. And I think that comes up also, that there's another, my other, it's not a secret agenda, but it's a nice prize at the end. Has to do more with the work on Newton, like the stuff he says in the General Scholium, that he says almost nothing about what his metaphysical commitments are, but the claim sort of against the blind necessity that Newton also remarks, I think can be understood a lot better given what Moore is working. So,
but just one example where it might be fruitful to consider also this theological context. You mentioned at the very beginning that he attacks also Spinoza's Tractatus.
yes.
And if we go back to this atheistic tractates of Moore, you see that the literal interpretation of scripture is actually the first origin of atheistic interpretation. So in that sense, the ethics and the Tractatus is not, probably from his point of view, not so far from each other, and we can remember the theses like Bible criticism and rise of Protestant Bible criticism and rise of scientific evolution, etc. So I think that this kind of exegetical framework is also essential.
I'm sure.
I have several questions, and I'm trying to be focused. One is more of a comment, so I'll make it quickly. I don't think Spinoza is an essential story, an essential part of Moore's development as a philosopher. Many of these views that he's articulating are articulated already when he's composing his thoughts against Descartes. So I think there's something a bit misleading about sort of bringing Spinoza as something that's helpful in understanding Moore. I don't think so, but it's just a general impression that I have. I don't want to argue that point, just a general comment that, because I think I disagree with your presentation that says both figures as essential for understanding Moore. It's maybe essential for understanding Moore when he presents his views against Spinoza, but or as you say, he's a bit defensive when he comes close to what Spinoza is saying of it, but it's not part of how his views are formed, because I think they're formed much earlier. But just a comment, I'll leave that aside for now. So what I want to argue is that maybe this charge of atheism is more of a general way of positioning himself against Descartes and against Moore, but the real issue is allowing for providence or divine providence, or allowing the presence of God in the world. So the atheism is just what we might get if we don't get divine providence. The focus of the philosophical debate is about whether we can find divine providence in Spinoza and in Descartes.
Back to something.
So the charge of atheism is this big fear that comes about when all of the debate ends, right? But really the issue where he finds fault with in Descartes and in Spinoza is the issue of divine providence, the issue of having a God being present in the world. And so I would, if you present this various parts and you show the letters to Descartes after you show what he says about the necessary existence of matter as supposedly following from Descartes' views. But the letters to Descartes is what initiates this whole thing. And I think if you want to understand how Moore's views are formed, you start from there. You start from the question, how is God present in the world? And then what is the nature of matter and what is the nature of space and its relation to God, following from that problem, not from the problem of atheism, but from the problem of providence.
I don't think those two are completely disconnected.
Of course not, no. But what is the focus of the philosophy?
Just the same. According to the definition of atheism, it's the same. Just the tautology. Providence is, or lack of providence is, a major atheistic concept.
Sure, but accusing Descartes of atheism is not for Descartes. His views are not atheist. But for Moore, it's atheist because God lacks providence, or God lacks presence in the world.
No, but if atheism doesn't mean denial of God's existence, but the impossibility of divine providence, that's a very different kettle of fish. Because Descartes' God, as Noa said before, is external to the world at best. Spinoza, God, again, does not have a persona by which to intervene. And in the Kabbalistic pictures, God is a structure, again, not a person. So if providence is the issue, there's a whole set of atheisms coming from all directions, and therefore it's a key, it's a multifaceted key issue, which means nothing like the denial of the existence of God. That's not on the table at all.
But accusing
You agree with me, yes?
but accusing Descartes of being an atheist would be ridiculous for Descartes,
Yes,
because so it's
Yes.
changing the meaning of atheism to correspond to lack of providence, the lack of presence in the world, because Descartes believes that God can act in the world. It's just God is not present in the world.
Merced and Genesis commentary count 219 atheistic systems. None of them speaks about the non-existence of God.
Again, but it's a specific kind of providence, because for Descartes, God can act in the world, but he can't be present. Yes. Go ahead.
I want to follow your suggestion, your initial suggestion, and ask about the big picture.
yeah,
How do you construe the relevance of this discussion of the Moore's reaction to Spinoza? What is from this discussion, does something new surface in terms of idea, or is there, does it have an influence on the evolution of theological or philosophical or scientific ideas? Are you, I was just asking about the background, the framework of your reflection. Are you walking on the footsteps of Poiré and from the closed universe to the open universe and what he writes about more, or what is the direction he? Who is on the side of progress? Who is not on the side of progress? How do you construe the dynamic of this discussion?
the way I'm going about, why, I'll say this, why it's important to me, why it's interesting to me is the following. And this is just coming at it from a very different direction while I was working on Spinoza's metaphysics. And then it's commonplace to sort of not take what Spinoza has to say about physics very seriously. There's that little part, the physical digression, and like, oh, it doesn't really work, it's not that important. Oh yeah, and there's the conatus, and yeah, that sort of changes what Descartes says, but not that much. And then let's keep working on Spinoza's metaphysics and epistemology. I think independently, my work was focusing on the account of Spinoza's account of body. And then reading more made it clear to me that, of course, there's the large theological considerations in the background, and it might be that they're more important. And I think that's probably even true. But I think what is evident in Moore, and I think is also evident in a way, sort of echoed in a way in Newton, that Spinoza is offering foundations for a physics that is not mechanistic, and that's going back to Owen's point, where God isn't active. There isn't the creative God. He's not acting in the world in any way that would be providence. So it's like this very suddenly there's this alternative view that's not mechanistic and at the same time doesn't require a creative God. And I think that makes Moore very nervous. I think that's that's showing my hand.
I have another question. Yeah.
Okay. Actually, there's a lot to talk about the overall background and the theological, most theological confirmations. Do you know in any explicit way compare Spinoza with Spinoza religion enthusiast? He uses precisely the same term.
Good question.
Medicalization terms used to describe this phenomenon. He described it.
It's a good question. I don't know. I don't know.
I was wondering how these two descriptions can coexist and what do they mean formally on this logical space left to move for more plainly. Because basically, God is outside the world, we get something, God is equal to the world, in a particular case of not being outside the world,
Yeah.
we get something completely similar. So,
Yeah. The first question I don't know, and it's a very good question that I should know.
Logically, doesn't seem to be the case because in Antidote Against Atheism, he explains that atheism and enthusiasm are two opposites. So if he's coherent and he blames with atheism, it shouldn't be an enthusiasm.
one is not always good.
Okay.
Yeah.
The problem with enthusiasts for more is that they pretend to have God's presence, and he's not. So they're lying.
These are the terms.
Yeah. Yeah, that I have to
Folks, where we heading, where you take this things.
And the second question, I think this makes clear in a way that the pressure he's under, right? On the one hand, wanting every natural phenomena to be conceived through God, but it not following necessarily. So and then
I mean, in logical term, how much space does he ends up with while being committed to those things?
I think the way he does it is insisting that ground zero on creation. And I think that he thinks that stops the top-down route because creation is not necessary. And creation involves counsel. So I think that's where he stops that's where the room he sees between Descartes and Spinoza. So on the one hand, there's creation, and he also fits into creation that at every interaction, there has to be, even if it's not divine activity, there's a spirit of a world that then is sort of related to God. So he has God doing a lot more than on Descartes' field.
My question is, does he have a better answer than to Spinoza than there are many substances? Because it seems like just insisting on the point without answering Spinoza's argument that if you want to conceive the substance through itself, you can't have two substances of the same attribute.
I think that the place where he sort of presses Spinoza more is on the divisibility. He says Spinoza's the weirdo because obviously matter is divisible, right? But he's insisting that it's not separable. I say the most natural things, that divisibility implies separability. So I think it's not just the created substances stuff, more as how to understand divisibility.
Right, that's a separate argument, but this quote that you had for why there are many substances of the same kind and one substance can.
So I think in 1P5, where it says there can't be substances with the same attribute. I think more there levels a really good objection to Spinoza. He says, of course they can have something in common, being a substance. And Spinoza has to do not a very comfortable dance.
But there's an argument for why there can't be, because it's the same attribute. So how are you going to conceive of the different substances? That's an argument. I mean, you might not accept it, but it doesn't seem like he's engaging with it.
In a way, his engagement isn't satisfying because it says, of course there are little things. Right? It's so crazy.
Okay, thank you very much.
The question.
אני לא יודע אם משפיע.
I'm just arriving.